So thank you everyone for joining us tonight for the Accelerating the Accelerators panel on how the big fish can feed the little fish. I am joined by four amazing panelists, Donna, Kalsoom, Charles, and Craig. And we're going to kick it off with brief introductions from each of them, showing in 30 to 60 seconds, their background, current role in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And then we'll dive into some questions we've got and certainly have time for folks in the chat to chime in and ask their questions. So without any further ado, Donna Harris, could you please introduce yourself to the audience tonight?
Sure. Great to see you all. And great to see some familiar faces and old friends as well. Donna Harris, I'm the CEO of Builders and Backers. I'm also the general partner of 1776 Ventures. Long and storied history with ecosystem building dating back now almost a decade. Started this work back in Startup America days where I was managing director, and my job was actually built around the whole concept that we needed to support entrepreneurs outside of Silicon Valley, and was very much in the early days of helping people understand what this means and how do we do it and what does that look like. And my thinking has evolved a lot over the last decade, so I'm looking forward to digging in with everybody.
Wonderful. Thanks, Donna. Kalsoom, you're up next.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Kalsoom Lakhani. My current hat is that I'm the co-founder and general partner at iDive Ventures. We are a early stage venture capital fund for Pakistan, which we believe is the next big untapped startup market, which given that startups have raised over $100 million this year, which is like 2019 and 2020 combined, it's kind of like growing exponentially right now, which is really exciting. Prior to launching iDive Ventures, I was the founder of our sister entity, Invest to Innovate, which has been an ecosystem builder and enabler in Pakistan and other frontier markets since 2011. And our big belief, similar to Donna with 1776 and what they're doing, is that we believe that the next great innovators aren't coming from Silicon Valley, they're coming from places like Nigeria and Pakistan. And so beyond having built the first startup accelerator program in Pakistan, we also expanded that work to support other ecosystem builders in other markets close by. So worked in Bangladesh, Nepal, Cambodia, a number of other places. So excited to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Charles, you're up next.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Mike, it's great to be here with you in this very esteemed panel. My name is Dr. Charles Corprew. I am the senior lead of network at Camelback Ventures. Network is kind of our colloquialism for our alumni. I come to this work interestingly with not the traditional pedigree of venture. I was a professor of psychological science and started my own social impact consulting firm. Met Aaron, started really talking about education and how we could really impact entrepreneurs and women, and ran our accelerator at Camelback for 2 cycles. And what we realized is that with the pandemic, when we were going to hold off our accelerator, what was going to happen with our founders? And so I said, hey, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to create a robust propulsion for our founders post-fellowship. And so now I work with a wonderful team of creating programming, funding, opportunities, building stakeholders. Mike and I spend a lot of time on the phone, chewing it up about how we can actually continue to help our founders. So love what I do. Camelback Ventures is a friends and family round venture capital firm where we usually are the first money in for women in color, women and people of color, usually in education. And we've ventured out over the last 2 cycles to now what we call conscious tech, really is tech for good. So really excited about that work as well.
Love it. And last but not least, Craig.
Hey, thanks so much, Mike, and everybody. It's great to meet everybody today. I come from more of the operator side, so I've been a 6-time founder myself in multiple different verticals and industries, longtime startup enthusiast. Really over the past 5 or 6 years, have taken more of a mentorship role of a few different accelerator programs, including Launch. I've done some work with Halcyon and a number of others. I'm currently running a company called Growth University, which was a spin out from the Launch Accelerator, actually, where we found that the needs of founders to kind of approach growth holistically was a very real thing. And I had built this curriculum to kind of help startups grow and to try to figure out how do we grow these things once we're out in the wild. And that's what I do every day now. So I'm lucky to have that opportunity. Really excited to dig in.
Awesome. So we've set the stage. We know who's here going to share some wisdom with us. Would love to make this a free-flowing discussion. Panelists, we can popcorn around. I might call on somebody if you've got a great thing, but if you want to come off mute, I'll take that as a note that, hey, you've got something good to say. And for the attendees, feel free to drop some questions in the chat throughout the conversation. I'll have some time at the end for Q&A as well. And we'll make sure we wrap it up too with some, either LinkedIn links or places that people can connect with the panelists if they want to continue the convo. So first question, as we're thinking about ecosystems, and there's different fishes of different sizes in there, who are the key stakeholders in a thriving ecosystem? Hint, you're each some of them. Kalsoom, what you got?
I'll take a
Oh, go ahead, Craig. I'll go after you.
I think there's obviously founders, there's capital providers, resource providers, which I would kind of lump accelerators into both of those second categories, and then the rest of the supporting ecosystem. But I tend to look at a kind of a founder-centric view. You have to get founders in, you have to get them to, you have to build that trust with them. And so I would say that primarily starting with figuring out ways to add value to the founder life cycle, make their lives easier, make it better for them in terms of growing their startups and getting the resources that they need. So I would probably look at a founder first focus.
Sure. I'll just add to that. So our whole thesis with Eye to Eye, just as a background, is that we exist in places where it's really hard to be an entrepreneur. So for me, beyond what Craig said, because I think having like successful entrepreneurs in an ecosystem is really important from a big fish perspective, to your point, Mike. But also, I think some of the other levers that are really important, government plays a very, very strong role, especially in creating strong enabling environments for entrepreneurship, which in a lot of emerging and frontier markets has been very much a ceiling for innovation or an enabler of innovation. I'd also say universities are very important in terms of creating talent. And then I would also say from a support perspective, incubators, accelerators, co-working spaces all kind of fall into that umbrella of what exists in an ecosystem.
Donna or Charles, anything you want to add in terms of who are the stakeholders, and then maybe we can build from there on how do they most effectively interact with one another when, again, we're thinking about the ideal state ecosystem, not the other ones.
Mike, I think what also comes to mind to add to what my esteemed colleagues have said is also the customers that are entrepreneurs are wanting to bring in and be a part of this. Without customers, our entrepreneurs can't do anything. And so part of the work I do is spending time helping them think about ways to creatively find out the value that they can bring to their customers. And so it's always really interesting, like, hey, get that one thing and make sure that you're providing that value to the customer. So the customers to me are some of the most important stakeholders in the ecosystem.
Yeah, well said. I mean, we divide the universe really simplistically into three groups. There are builders, there are backers, and there's everyone else. And in essence, builders are the people who are building things. We tend to think of backers as people with money, but backers can be government entities, entrepreneurial support organizations, mentors, local government, economic development. It can also be you and I. We have a social following. We can tweet and highlight the startups in our community. I have a network. I can open doors for entrepreneurs in my community. And so ideally, anybody in our community is either building something or they're backing people who are building something. And the third category of everyone else, our goal should be to get them to see themselves in one of those two categories. And if we can broaden the definition of what we mean by backing, we can start to get more people in the community engaged in the things that entrepreneurs, the customer, need the most, which is very often social capital. And that's something all of us can be providing.
Donna, I love it. And I'd love to kind of dig in a little bit deeper on your definition of builder and sort of how you've adapted that from, instead of using the word entrepreneur, which perhaps there are people who would be terrified to name themselves an entrepreneur, but if they played with Legos when they were 5, they've built something. How do you kind of introduce that concept to get people almost like their first sip of entrepreneurial builder Kool-Aid?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing. Like, I love the word entrepreneur. I love entrepreneurs. I love the world of entrepreneurship, but we kind of got an upside down problem going on that if we think about how we define entrepreneurship today, the pendulum has swung from a decade ago. We were trying to convince the world that high growth startups mattered and that they needed different things than Main Street businesses. That pendulum swung all the way to the other side of the world, which is the perception that only scalable businesses matter, it to the degree that we're spending a lot of our energy in ecosystems focusing on this goal of venture capital. And the unintended consequence is that it's closing the aperture to what do we mean by entrepreneurship? Who sees themselves as an entrepreneur? What do we mean by entrepreneurial activity? And we need a widening of that. But it turns out, and I've studied this across the country for 3 years, it's really hard for people to see themselves as this because the media has fetishized this idea of entrepreneurship as unicorn. And everyday people don't see themselves doing that. But it turns out everyday people have amazing ideas. Some of them can turn into scalable businesses. So we've got to flip this around. We've got to stop building ecosystems for the 1% of companies that get venture capital and build it for the 100% of ideas that are out there. But it takes a more comprehensive strategy to do that and a different approach than I think we've been taking the last 10 years. And by calling people builders, it's fascinating just the different language that people say, I see myself as a builder. I have ideas I want to build. I have problems I want to solve. Any idea can apply. So, the sort of sense that we don't actually know what's going to scale until we try it. So we got to stop this sort of narrowed lens of work.
I just want to chime in really, really quickly. Donna, that's a wonderful, wonderful point. Conversations that I'm having with our entrepreneurs around the great ideas and acquiring customers and generating revenue and getting out of that mindset that I've got to be VC backed. Like, no, you don't. We'll get there, but that shouldn't be our first goal. But simply, I lived in a house with an entrepreneur and actually really never called her an entrepreneur. My mother grew and scaled a costume jewelry business. And we never thought about like, hey, mom's the entrepreneur in the family. She was a teacher, it was a side hustle. But she's over 20 years, she scaled that business, was able to employ people. And now it took me until probably early this year to realize like, oh, damn, my mom was the builder in the family. And so you're right, we have to be able to see other people outside of what we have categorized as entrepreneur and scalable to really encompass more people and to give them the motivation to really see what it feels like to scale in different ways and more diverse ways. So I love that.
Yeah. Can I add to that too? Because it really resonated with me that I think when we think about the messages that we're giving people, it's basically saying that unless you raise venture capital, you are not successful. You are not a builder, to your point, Donna. And I think about this, Pakistan, I think right now, even, Mike, you asked us to listen to like the next Silicon Valley podcast. And to me, it's like very triggering to hear that because it's basically saying like, we're basically promoting this, there's so much that's been toxic about Silicon Valley for so long. And I was like, in Pakistan, I'm seeing that right now, that even a recent graphic that came out basically only listed companies that had raised $1 million or more. And that was what we were deeming successful. And versus, I think there are so many companies that don't need to raise money in order to build their business, which I think is a really amazing success metric. And then the second thing too is that not everybody is the right fit for venture capital, and there's so many other types of instruments that exist that are out there. And I think where our sister entity that I founded is running an initiative with the World Bank under the Women's Entrepreneurial Finance Initiative, and specifically trying to move the needle on how more women-led companies can raise capital. And one thing that we've been finding is that a lot of women-led companies are not venture businesses, and that's okay. So how do we actually make more, like, how do we create more diversification on the funding side or the capital provider side that can actually be able to service and support amazing builders that are building great companies, but may not fit the box that other people are deeming as quote unquote success. So, yeah.
I have one quick thing to add there too. I mean, really great points all around. I think one point of, one issue could be just the word startup itself, right? I mean, I think the definition of a startup assumes certain things, or at least from the media perspective. But when you think about entrepreneurship, that the coffee shop next door or the dance studio or the tech company or the store that somebody created. Those are all entrepreneurial pursuits, and yet the word startup has this connotation around being some kind of tech related or venture scale related. And I wonder if there's some nomenclature resetting that we could dig into around that. I'm just curious, like, is there a nomenclature that's more appropriate to use when thinking about entrepreneurship more broadly, or do we still use the word startup? Because I wouldn't necessarily think that, my daughter's dance studio is a startup, but they're certainly an entrepreneurial business, and they're growing, and it's, how do we think about that?
Yeah, and especially in the digital era, if you think about this moment that we're in time, especially what we've seen in the last 18 months with the pandemic, this convergence of Main Street and digital, in that it's getting a little more difficult to discern between a Main Street business and an online business, a Main Street business and a digital play. And it's creating all kinds of really beautiful opportunities. But the way that we approach entrepreneurship today, we basically say, you have an idea, go start your business, and then go down this pathway. And that pathway is sort of marching you toward an exit. What we need to do is put some space between, I have an idea and I'm taking some sort of permanent action, right? This is where we have to teach people to go do discovery and actually go try your idea and put it to work. And then let's decide what's the right pathway for you. And it's about pathways as opposed to idea, startup, venture, exit as sort of the formula. And, to be clear, like, venture plays a really important role, but even most venture capitalists would say to you, like, we've gotten this completely backwards. It's only intended for moonshot companies, really expensive to scale companies, because it's the most expensive kind of capital you can get. But we've sort of taken the Silicon Valley mantra and we've turned it into everyday America community mantra. And we really want to create jobs. We want to create economic vitality in our communities. We don't necessarily need the Silicon Valley formula to do that. We need the Silicon Valley vehicles for the companies at the top of our pyramid that are expensive to scale. But we've just completely let it sort of take over everything in the community. And I think language, how we talk, the places and the spaces that we have for our communities, all of these things, I think, need a relook to say, how do we actually do this in light of this convergence in this moment that ideas can come from anywhere. They can be partly online and offline. They could be omni-channel. And by the way, we don't actually know if they're going to be a venture because it could just be a TikToker making all kinds of money. And like, there's all kinds of interesting, fun frameworks now for what an entrepreneur actually looks like. That doesn't necessarily mean startup. It doesn't mean venture.
Yeah, and so I think there are typically 3 T's that entrepreneurs need. It's time, talent, and treasure. And I'm curious, as we're trying to rethink, how these ecosystems can thrive, and clearly venture capital is not the solution. And, I don't think getting a boatload of money to a few folks at the top is what we're looking for. If we invert that, and I'll get this question, then Ian, I think you got a question too. I'll bounce it to you next after this one. How can we connect people in the ecosystem with time, talent, and treasure? And it may be founder or builders connection, or there may be other connections and ways to think about how to help some of these ideas and small businesses and startups and whatever other words we want to use kind of bubble up and get a little bit of that water and sunlight they need to sprout their first spring buds.
Well, I think maybe on the treasure side, some of the democratization of raising capital through crowdfunding platforms, some of the regulation, some of the bills that have passed on that side. I mean, I remember, I think it was a talk that Steve Case did in like 2010 or 2011. It was on the upcoming crowdfunding bills and stuff that were happening. I remember it was in DC at a big conference, and it was right when I was kind of getting into this world of the funding side of startups. And it was really eye-opening. And I think that that's become a catalyst for not venture-based businesses, but businesses that need some capital. I think there's kind of a couple roads. Like, can you start something as a side hustle, and can you get something off the ground? It's relatively easy to build software now with low code tools and things like that. But then customer acquisition is really hard. But not everybody has the opportunity to just take the plunge and go all in on something. So I think these crowdfunding platforms and a little bit easier access to some of that very early stage capital is a really great thing in the ecosystem. And it doesn't equal the venture funding side.
Yeah, I love it, Craig. And with EBITDA, there's no EBITDA without the E, which is earnings. So you have to have customers paying you for something to have some there. What does everyone else think about the time, talent, and treasure?
I think something that's so basic sometimes is creating space for all of those things to happen also serendipitously. I think we can also very intentionally create those connections I do that as a seed stage investor all the time. Like I think 99% of the work happens after I do the deal. And I'm actually like working with the company on like getting talent and working with them on strategy, like in terms of, post the treasure, it's like way more work. Right. But I actually think that like having kind of been on the ecosystem development side in a really nascent, difficult market for 10 years, right? Like so much value came from literally giving space to it. And Brad Fell talks about it in his book, Startup Communities. It's like just and I'm sure this happens in smaller cities in the US too, with like what you guys are building, what Donna's been building as well. It's like, there's so much need to like just create space for things and then allow people to just be able to connect and build relationships. And so even for me with what I was doing was so much of was like a peer-to-peer accelerator program where they were meeting mentors they met 50 mentors over the course of 4 months who they would never have met otherwise, but they were also building connections with each other. And these were people that were living in different cities across the country who had never met before and had never had a tribe of themselves. And you just see so much serendipitous, amazing network happen and community happen. And then as a result, addresses a lot of the talent, the time, like all the things that you see. But I think for me, my first thing that I always say is like, is there space for it? Oh, serendipity. Yeah. Oh, wait, I don't know whose book that is, but
I'll give a plug for Christian Bush's book here, Serendipity Mindset.
Oh, Chris Bush. That's why I know that name. Yeah. So that's Chris's book. But yes, exactly. Like you need that space for serendipity where you're not over engineering it as well. There needs to be space for people to just do things.
And one of the analogies I heard, I think it might have been Frank Gruber at Startup of the Year or something, was you get enough smart people in a small space and like molecules, they just bounce around and hit one another. And then you get these interactions and reactions and these long tail effects of people you met at a conference several years ago. Like Kalsoom, we were on a board of a nonprofit, 8 years ago, and these relationships flourish over time. And for some of these folks, it's not their first or second thing. It might be their fifth or sixth that,
but there's so much
them.
Unlearning that I'd also have to add. There's so much unlearning that also has to happen. Sometimes I think when you come from here as well, but also especially cultures where it's such a rent-seeking culture, there's such a culture of scarcity that only one person can succeed. When you're trying to rebuild for like community and collaboration and this idea of like helping each other helps everybody, it lifts everyone. It's almost like an unlearning that you have to create those environments and you have to create like those conditions in order for that to happen. Because I think a lot of the times these cultures, especially, I can say this across South Asia and emerging markets, like they just don't exist in those environments. So you have to allow that to happen.
It's also a function of habits and behaviors. So we often think that, this is only a problem in big communities, but I literally this afternoon facilitated conversation amongst some builders in a tiny little town, 30,000 total population. You'd think everybody in the town knows one another, but yet they're not talking. They don't know who's doing what. There just needs to be more opportunities for this free exchange of ideas and for engaging in the importance of social capital. But it's not our default habit. And for a lot of people, it's not their default or comfortable zone to ask for help, to share their half-baked ideas. Many people feel like they've got to have all the answers, that they're uncomfortable sharing at the idea stage. So there is, as Kalsoom said, there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen and retraining. Social capital doesn't happen all by itself. It has to be facilitated. And I actually think it's one of the most difficult things to do in ecosystems and one of the most important things for ecosystem leaders to focus on.
Charles, anything you want to add before we hop to Ian's question?
No, they've done a wonderful job in really synchronizing everything I was thinking about.
But we had synchronized swimming practice earlier. We were watching the Olympics, so we figured out how to do the leg kicks and everything. So Ian, over to you, my friend.
So quick comment and then a question about language. The comment being, we track 4 success measures in our alumni: longevity, revenue, funds raised, and hires. And we find that the attributes of the entrepreneurs split them into 2 groups. The people who do well at longevity do well at revenue, and the people who do well at funds raised do well at hires, although I suspect the hires is because we're only looking at companies, all our companies are by default less than 15 years old. So they're, you know, people who raise money tend to hire more people faster at that stage. Question about language. So I've been having conversations about accelerators since Digital by Design 1995. Although they weren't called that then. I don't remember what it was called. I remember that the particular one was exactly an accelerator, but because it wasn't in San Francisco, nobody remembers it. And entrepreneur meant to undertake risk, and startup meant the business model is not yet defined. So if my parents give me a business, I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm running a business. If I start a company that has a very defined business model, I start another coffee shop, it's not a startup. I know what the business model is, right? But these words, we don't, as noted, we don't really use these words for that anymore, because words don't always mean the same thing over time. They change. That's a thing that happens. But one of the things I noticed as I started working with communities where English was not the first language is that we had, as George Bush famously did not say, the Americans took a French word, right? But like when I started working in Latin America, I was told we don't really have a word for entrepreneur. We're coming up with one. Danielle from Agora told me this in like 2005, and I think they settled on empresada. I can't pronounce it right. For those of you who work outside of the English language, which I'm hoping is more than just Kalsoom, so that I'm not putting you on the spot, what are the words used, and are they the same or are they different? Like, I'm curious as to how, because it's very much, when we've been discussing, it's very much a US term in my limited exposure because of my limited language abilities. Because I know other folks have the different words and different meanings. Has anybody encountered a different set of meanings for the same concepts we're talking about?
I'll go first. I mean, Ian, we were in Singapore together working with like programs across Asia, and it was fascinating because I actually think that the export of Silicon Valley and the ideas and the thought process has meant that like we use the words that we're using are actually the same words that we're reading about. So kids that I'm meeting, and a lot of my original hires, and I know 500 did this too as they expanded globally. I was hiring a lot of kids that were running TEDx's and startup weekends, right? And so those words became exported and then ultimately became part of the vernacular as a result. And so I don't really see it being different. And actually that was what was most fascinating. Ian and I I was one of the partners and was working with programs across Asia. And I met these guys from Fiji. And I think I was one of the only program partners from one of the countries that was being presented. So that was really fascinating for me. But I met these dudes from Fiji. We sat down and talked. The only guys from Fiji. Yeah.
Well, no, you were the only partner.
I was the only partner from the region. Yeah. But I remember just sitting down with these guys, and we were just basically like realizing that everything that they went through with building an angel investor network in Fiji is what I had gone through building an angel investor community in Pakistan. And so what I find really interesting, not to your point about language, but more about just for me, the similarities that exist, less about the words that we use and more about the cultural similarities of how we build trust, especially in the absence of infrastructure that creates trust, right? When you don't have a strong intellectual property regime, when you don't have laws that really protect minority investors, like all of these things, everything becomes extremely relational. And so I think that's also the reason why I've been able to work across those markets, because it's something that's very transferable. But I think the words tend to be the same because we just use the English words. But I think the application of it and how it gets localized is very similar across a lot of these markets with each other. I don't know if that answered your question, but that was just my thought.
Oh, it's valuable input.
Any other thoughts from the panel on language? And I will admit that I failed college because Spanish was so hard. I went 0 for 3 on the SAT too, so I cannot speak intelligently. I can't even do it well in English, so I'm not gonna try other words.
Well, I mean, a Global Entrepreneurship Network, we have about 172 countries participating. And, there are so many opportunities that their goal is to, in essence, share the quote unquote best practices, which is leading to this unifying of, singular model, singular language, singular approach, which, for better or worse, like there's a lot of pros to that for sure, because we can share what's working. Here's how we got this done in our country or our community. What can I learn and apply that to my own community? But it also means that the challenges we've already been discussing are replicating globally, like little bunnies hatching all over the world. And so, it's fantastic, but it's also a double-edged sword, because we have to be careful that what we are replicating is truly a best practice and not just parroting because we think that's what we should be saying, because it's the traditional way we describe this activity.
So I'm going to transition out of some of the treasure conversations with a quick story about a $5 bill that walked into a bar, and the bartender said, "Hey, this is a singles bar." And from there, I'm curious, panelists, what do you think about talent in the ecosystem and the different types of talent, bringing people in-house, everything from universities and internships. And I know that was painful. There'll be more. Don't worry. How do you think about the talent that entrepreneurs can attract to them? And Donna, maybe I'll put you on the spot first, because I vividly remember a conversation I had with you at 1776, and you're like, "I've got this analogy of a canoe, where you're in this canoe and you're paddling, and you see Kalsoom, and you're like, 'Hey, Kalsoom, you want to get my canoe?' And you start paddling, and you're like, 'Hey, Kalsoom, I got this extra paddle. You wanna do a little back there?' And suddenly you can go a lot faster." And I've probably told that story to 100 different entrepreneurs, by the way, of like, how do you attract talent towards you? And so what do you think about the different types of talent that can help a builder or an entrepreneur or someone in that the early stages both get a little bit of momentum and also not have to hold everything in their head by themselves, and like start to learn how to delegate or manage, other people, and trust that they don't have to do it all?
I love the canoe analogy, and I love that you remember the canoe analogy. It brings a tear to my eye. I think the reason the analogy is really, appropriate is because entrepreneurs, we tend to be very action oriented. So we see a problem, we jump in our canoe, we start paddling. We're paddling super, super hard, usually against the current, because we're countercultural and we're trying something new. But oftentimes we don't stop for a minute and say, wait a minute, wouldn't this be easier if there were other people in the canoe? And so we're busy canoeing right past all kinds of people on the banks. And we're not actually asking them to get in the canoe with us. And if they're in the canoe, we're not actually handing them a paddle, right? So I've invested in one entrepreneur that I continually bang my head against the wall, because he just does not understand the number of people around him that he could be asking for help. And I feel like I have the same conversation every time I talk to him. Like, why wouldn't you ask so-and-so for help with that? Why wouldn't you tell your board that you were struggling with that? Why wouldn't you ask us if we could open those doors for you? It's the sense of like, I've got to just buck up and I've just got to go muscle this through. But, it does take a village to raise a startup. It really, really does. And we've got to sort of set aside a little bit of that hubris to go tell people what you need. What specifically are you struggling with? And then find the absolute best person to help you with that. And I think this is where place-based entrepreneurship is super hard, because the reality is, in a lot of communities all over the world, the best mentors and the best talent don't live in the same community as the entrepreneur. And this is where I think sometimes we do a disservice to our entrepreneurs by focusing our mentor, sort of communities and outreach locally in the idea of like, who can I get to volunteer to help? And we need to flip that around and say, who are the absolute best people that my companies need? What industries are they in? What struggles are they having? What business models do they have? Where are those amazing, best-in-class people? And can I get them to commit some of their time to help my companies, regardless of where they live? So, I think we've got to both have a mindset shift teach that mindset shift. And then we have also got to think both local and global about, what are the common things that we just see over and over again our entrepreneurs are struggling with. Let's go curate the absolute best people to help them with those things.
Donna, I definitely agree with that. The hard part for many of our entrepreneurs is that because they're so early stage, they don't have the capital. And so what we've done at Camelback is that we try to, as much as we can with my team, is that we're kind of the adjunct team for them when they need solutions or short-term work to help them. As well as knowing, like, sometimes a chief operating officer or a chief technical officer or CTO is that person. So we have the ability to bring in some fractional support for them, and that we're fortunate enough to be in a position where we can pay for that for a period of time, or as the chief of staff. One of our more robust companies, Connecty, we moved her into our venture studios because we saw the opportunity for scale and growth, and she's an amazing, Norma Padres is an amazing, super dope founder. But with her chief of staff, Gabrielle Ellis, now her ability to scale the venture it's easier. As you said, there are more paddles in the boat, and Gabriella just takes so much off of her plate that it helps her with decision making. It has allowed Connected to scale out and up, which is a wonderful thing. We're fortunate at Camelback, as I said, that we can provide that. Myself and one of my counterparts, we have that startup experience and leadership experience that we can help a number of our entrepreneurs move through that space. The last thing I'll say is that we've created an expert bench where I can bring in and pay for longer term consultancies for our for-profits where, okay, you've got this need for a CTO. We can't do it on this long-term base. I can bring somebody in and pay a part of that for them. So it's a wonderful place for us to be in, but not many of our entrepreneurs have that opportunity outside of Camelback.
Yeah. I think just to add to what you were saying, Donna, as well, like there's such a sense of, I think from a characteristic standpoint, I'm sure we all do, but I look for this in founders is like the sense of humility that you don't know everything, right? And not only do you not, I think when you have that as a quality, I think automatically you start to be someone that's like, I don't know everything. I need someone else in the room that also can help fill this gap for me. So knowing firstly where you're lacking is like sometimes requires so much more self-awareness than we assume people have that. And then I realized so quickly after having worked with so many founders that not a lot of people have that. And so we're closing a deal. This is live, but it's fine. We're closing a deal in a female founded fintech right now. And for me, one of the biggest, most exciting things was that she was both the founders, but especially the CEO. You could see that she was super able to inspire people with how she communicated the vision of what she was building. So that's number one, like so important in terms of attracting talent because people could go work anywhere, right? And especially right now in Pakistan, it's like a big outsourced place. A lot of Silicon Valley firms are hiring for their back-end tech shop. So you want people that can inspire people with their vision. But then also, I mean, her CTO and chief product person, one's in Congo, one's in Toronto. And when I spoke to both of them, it became so clear why I was backing this team or why we were backing this team was because they were so excited by what they were building. It went so much beyond the what of what they were doing and the why behind it. And then also you saw they were like, wow, she was able to attract this level of talent. It didn't, to your point about remote work, like it's okay if they're sitting in Canada or they're sitting in Congo of all places, but they're able to be asynchronous in how they manage teams and how they build things. And so I think for me, that became like the biggest check mark of why I was investing in this company was their ability to attract not just talent, but like high quality talent that felt empowered to go out and execute and also felt really inspired by the vision of what the founders were building. So, I mean, those to me are like super important traits that I look for.
I would quickly add, I think that when asking for help, there's kind of like a perceived overhead in asking for help, even if the founder has some humility, like maybe they think it's a dumb question. Maybe they really truly believe that they should figure this out because they've been trained as a CEO. You're supposed to figure out a lot of stuff on your own. Maybe they don't have the ability to kind of disconnect. There's so many things going on. It's so chaotic. So I wonder, like, is there some standardization around facilitating the ask for help or the call to action? I'm just, kind of brainstorming here, but I wonder if there's ways that, because I've worked with some really great founders who are very humble, and they often, when you get them talking, they have all these questions, but they're not asking them on their own, right? They need to be prompted and pushed and poked and prodded a little bit. How do we do a better job facilitating that, I wonder?
Yeah, I mean, our culture of always killing it is killing it, right? Like we have to have this perception of how are things going? Oh, I'm killing it. It's going awesome. But like, meanwhile, we're struggling like ducks paddling under the water like crazy. You have no idea what we're doing. We're afraid to ask the questions. We're afraid to signal weakness. We never know who's going to be a potential funder. So we're always thinking we've got to present the best possible story of our business. And I think it behooves us that are mentors, investors, board members, advisors, senior people in our communities, to have sort of habits and practices that we employ when we're meeting with founders. So one of my habits is that I always ask at the end of every meeting, tell me what I can do to help you. And I always try to end the meeting on some specifics, and literally they're squirrely. Trying to get them to just articulate something is amazingly hard. And so, we have to train people to do that, because we live in a society that hasn't trained us to be comfortable showing weakness and being okay saying, I'm not actually killing it. I have a lot of questions.
Totally. And I almost feel like teaching entrepreneurs how to always have a list in their pocket of like the 3 things they need help with. And like, oh, can you help with A, B, or C? Like I've already thought about it, and I think about it every night at 3 a.m. when I wake up, and put it in my journal so I can try to fall back to sleep. The willingness to acknowledge it. And I think part of it is blaming on social media, and like everybody has this delicious $15 avocado toast on Instagram with the perfect filter. It looks amazing, but then they're eating ramen for dinner. It's like, let me show you this like one really nice thing I had, but meanwhile, parts of my business don't work. My hair's on fire. I'm overwhelmed and stretched so thin. Do you guys have any other ideas or thoughts on ways that we, as I'll say, like ecosystems, support humans and organizations, can maybe normalize some of the sharing of the hardships and the anxiety and the uncertainty? Because if they don't talk about it, we never know what's going on under the water as they're pedaling or paddling.
I think a part of it is to Donna's point, it's, it was like a 2-person conversation. I think it's also super important to create safe spaces as people that are in ecosystem building, right? And Charles, I'm sure you do this in the programs that you build. And I know 1776 and Halcyon did that as well. I mean, for us, like what we would do in a country like Pakistan, where it is not okay to talk about, especially for men, to talk about weakness at all. Like we actually when we were running our accelerator program, it's 6 weekends over 4 months and across the country. So they were getting access to networks of different mentors. But the very first weekend, we went up to the mountains in Pakistan. It was completely just a community building retreat. I ran all this stuff around vulnerability, stuff that was so woo-woo for these dudes that were literally, I mean, it was a mix of women and men, but like these guys were literally like, what the F is this? Like, why am I here? What is going on? But I swear to God, at the end of that weekend, every single person, there was such a deep sense of trust. And we went from like the very beginning of the weekend, one of the founders telling me, hey, are we going to sign an NDA before we go into this? And I would just be like, if you want to sign it at the end of the weekend, we can. And at the end of the weekend, he was like, we don't need to sign an NDA because we built that, right? And that's why those spaces are great, because it's not just about me as their, and from a facilitator perspective or running an accelerator, even me as their investor now, I'm wearing a different hat, but it's also the founders with each other and creating that space where they're okay to share that. And so, and I think that's so powerful to me, because that it doesn't matter where you exist in the world. I feel like everybody, the minute one of my favorite emotional intelligence like seminars that I've taken, they always say that you can only be as vulnerable as the least vulnerable person in the room. So what are you doing to actually create a sense of people being able to open up? And if people don't feel safe, they won't, right? So what are you doing to unpack that and like basically unveil the layers so everyone can do that? And yeah, it just requires a lot of like facilitation, active facilitation, and just kind of giving space for people to do that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Charles.
No. Go ahead, I can finish out.
I was just going to say this is really tactical, but one thing that I've been doing with both my company as well as some founders that I'm friends with is we're doing like a monthly recap. So once a month, just send an update and tell me one thing that's going really well and tell me one thing that's not going well. And it really forces you to think of the negative side. It actually forces you to do it. And I think that forcing function alone, at least personally for the stuff that I'm going through building my own company, it's been kind of cathartic in many ways to realize that, like, yes, there are a bunch of negative. There's some really great stuff going on and there's some real big challenges, and let's vocalize that a little bit. It's been really helpful.
Yeah, that sounds good, Craig. One of the things that we've been wrestling with is one of our founders that we think very, very highly of, that we've invested in, ironically, is the CEO of a meditation company. And very often we will get an email reply from him, or I'm taking a sabbatical. And sometimes we're like, you've been on sabbatical for a little while. And I'm like, but this is his way of self-care, because when he does come back from these little small sabbaticals, he's focused, he understands. But we've had to recalibrate how we work with him, because it is not that typical grind of of a builder, entrepreneur. And so we had to actually spend some time as a staff and like, okay, how do we recalibrate ourselves around this? Because he's showing up and he's saying that, and he's saying, look, I created this company because of my own burnout as a tech as a tech builder on Wall Street. So this is what I have to do to make sure I can show up as the best version of myself in leading this company. So that's been very interesting for us the big push for us as how are we making sure that we're showing up for our founders in a very equitable manner?
Meeting them.
Love that. I mean, we're simultaneously having the conversation about how we're a society always on 24/7. We're killing it. We're presenting that image on social media. At the same time, we're a society filled with depression, suicide, drug use, right? Especially in the world of startup, we're hearing a lot about mental health challenges. Like, something's wrong here. And it's up to us as leaders to model vulnerability, model that we all struggle. Life is seasons. Entrepreneurship is hard. I think this is all so important. I love these ideas. I also would like to go on an extended sabbatical. So I love that.
I'll just say this last thing. One thing that I love about our organization is that we have unlimited PTO. And ironically, it's a head fake, because very rarely do we take a lot of time off. But just knowing that it's there when we need to. I was in a car accident a couple of weeks ago, and my manager was like, I'm gonna need you to take some time off. Like, it's okay. And I was like, okay, I'll take some time off. But yeah, that's a part of it as well.
I saw a little Simon Sinek video with Seth Godin the other day. He's like, yeah, my organization, we have 5 duvet days a year. He's like, what's that? It's like, oh, it's when you might have fake called out sick, but you just call in the morning, you say, I'm taking a duvet day. Nobody asks any questions. Nobody's allowed to communicate with you all day, and you show up the next day. People are already doing it. It's called, I got a 24-hour bug. What if we just said, this is normal, just like take the day, do what you got to do. Yeah. So I like that idea. And we've got about 9 minutes left. So I do want to see if we have any questions from the audience. Eric or Patty, anyone else have any other questions? If not, I got one more we can roll into, and then we'll kind of get some closing thoughts and how folks here can follow up with the panelists.
Mike, this is Patty. I do have a question. I'm not sure if, yeah, okay, I'm off mute.
I can hear you.
Thank you, excellent. Yeah, no, I mean, this has been really great. Thank you for pulling this wonderful group of people together and sharing your thoughts. I mean, it's interesting, and Mike and I, we spoke earlier this week about kind of the idea of the big fish and the little fish, and kind of how ecosystems that are more established can kind of feed into the growing world of startups. And I guess I'm interested to kind of hear from those who are sort of working at the larger scale. Like, are you kind of intentionally tapping into whole communities that are coming out of some of these bigger fish, be it AOL, be it Deloitte, any of these groups? But are there established programs that you use to kind of make that pipeline of talent and money and support more accessible to some of the founders that you work with?
That's a great question. And I'm going to fill 10 seconds of airtime while everybody here thinks of really intelligent things to say to it, because they had a list of the other questions to think about. But what do we think, about tapping into some of those big fish or like large companies that made a bunch of millionaires, and, how can they add value to the next generation, or, ways to set up those pipelines?
Well, I'll start with some early thoughts and hope others jump in. I'll say one positive thing and one challenging thing. So the connections aren't going to happen by default, right? These companies grew, these people have been super busy, hunkered down, doing their job. It's not top of mind to think, oh, I should go see if there's an ecosystem. I should see if I can mentor. I should get involved. So oftentimes it just takes somebody to come and poke at it a little bit and say, hey, would you want to come do this? Here are opportunities. Here is a point of entry to just start getting you to come out, right? Easy lift, simple starter point. So I think there's just purely being intentional about it. I found, here in Washington, D.C., our fundamental premise when we launched 1776 years ago was I went all over the community and I went and talked to really super smart people in things like education and healthcare and energy and transportation and said, has anyone ever asked you to come and mentor and help a startup? And 100% of them said no. No one had ever asked them. And like 99% of them said they totally would be interested in doing that if they were asked. So sometimes it is just the intentionality that's needed. I'll say that with the other side of the coin, which is be super careful about what role you ask them to play, because many of the people at these big fish organizations don't know how to build a business in the digital era. And so be cautious about what role they're playing in giving founders advice. And, if we're going to call them mentors, make sure they're mentoring around a specific topic area with some guidance and guardrails around that, because one of the things that I've seen that is most damaging to startups, particularly now in this digital moment, is people that have had success in non-digital businesses that actually scaled 15 and 20 years ago are now coming and giving advice to startups, and it's out-of-date advice, as well-intentioned as they are. So, two sides to that coin to just be very cautious about.
Donna, you're on point tonight. You're definitely on point. When I created this role at Camelback, that is a part of the great work that I get to do, is see how connections can fit into our portfolio and building those relationships. And oftentimes for me, and everybody on this panel has probably heard this before, is that I never go looking for a certain thing. I go looking to build a relationship. And that's how Mike and I met at SoCap a couple of years ago. I saw him with a Nationals hat. I'm a Yankees fan, and so we connected over baseball, but we've been able to create a relationship over the last couple of years where now we've been able to plug into each other and assist each other through a cadre of different things. I do that with our stakeholders. And then when something comes up where I say, okay, this fits very well, I can plug them into our founders because we've built these relationships around something. Oftentimes it's baseball or cycling or something, but they're really ingrained in entrepreneurship and building, and I can bring them in to work with our entrepreneurs. But Donna, the point that you make is so great, is that I want to make sure that you can provide for our founders. And now it's great that you built this early on, but thinking through this meditation app that needs social media and PR to scale because that's his clientele, that's his market. Can you advise on that, right? Can you help and support that? So that's really, really crucial. And I'll just stop. That's the period there.
I would quickly add that running one of those really late stage companies as well couldn't be more different than early go to market. And this is where I think this often goes wrong, is that you might get a big name mentor or somebody come in, but what the founder actually needs is really tactical help. And that's tough. It's a tough spot to be. But fully agree on everything that Donna and Charles said thus far.
I think sometimes just a tactical thing I would say is that sometimes it's good to bring in, totally agree with everything. I actually feel like people that have built companies in this era are much better fits generally. But again, to Craig's point, they could be a much later stage company, maybe not as a good fit. I always think it's really great if you have like a cohort of people or just like a couple people rather than force fitting. Like I hate sometimes when you're like doing mentor matching, and I guess Ian, you've done this with Mentor Capital Network for a long time, but like when you're mentor matching, sometimes it's like retrofitting or you're forcing two people to like hang out together versus I feel like when you bring a mentor into a community and you see who they like and vice versa, and there's almost like a double opt-in, that actually creates sometimes more meaningful relationships moving forward where they really feel both sides feel excited about it rather than a mentor that was saying like, I want to help, because it comes from a place, it's a great intention sometimes, but it comes from a place of like almost like I'm trying to save you versus like we can benefit from this, and it feels much more of a mutual relationship. So just a tactical thing.
Cultural fit is so much more important. Our whole program is focused around variations on speed dating, getting both sides to choose. The technical knowledge is the easy part, or easier. The getting people who want to spend time with each other, who are probably not getting paid to do it, at least not in the short term, is the psychology of that, getting them to choose how they communicate as why they want to work with that person amongst the set of folks who have the skills. But that's the entire focus of our research.
I love it. And we've got about 60 seconds to wrap it up. For each of the panelists, Donna, I'm going to pull a page out of your book because the theme that I got from this was that everyone needs to intentionally ask for help. So for the panelists, what do you need help with? And how can this community help you? And Donna, if you've got something, we'll go with you and then popcorn around, and I'll close us out with a very corny dad joke.
I love it. Can't wait for the joke. Okay, so you can help me. Builders and Backers is a fairly new movement. So if you could follow us on social, share our links, and have others in your network share as well, that would be great, because we are putting to work a lot of what we talked about today. So love you to follow on and help spread the word.
I would ditto that. Camelback Ventures is a wonderful firm. We're 7 years old. The more that people know about us, the opportunities, the more that people know about our founders and the great work that we're doing, we would love that support. I'm always looking for critical mentors and stakeholders that I can surgically match with my founders. So if you know people who, particularly our CTOs or chief operating officers around marketing and PR support, that would be great. But please check out Camelback Ventures and plug us as much as possible.
I'll go. Yeah, I run Growth University, and we're very, very early stage. There's 5 of us right now, and we're growing this thing, and we provide basically growth marketing training for startups, and we're getting into some other fields as well. We've got some other programs that are tangentially related, but that's our core focus. So yeah, if you have any founders who are interested, we often do scholarships. We are happy to partner with Accelerators to run discount programs, and we've got a bunch of great free programs as well. And we do monetize some of the other stuff that we do. But yeah, anybody that could be relevant, send our way.
Yeah, I guess for me, personally, and then also I guess for our founders, personally, I mean, I'm new to venture capital. We just opened the doors to our fund in 2019. So it's been a really steep but super fun learning journey for me. And I didn't realize how fun it was going to be, to be honest. I thought like VC was evil before I came into it. And now I'm like, wow, this is like, there's so many amazing humans that are building great stuff. So I'm really excited to learn from people, and I'm just continuing to learn. I'm kind of like a sponge right now, especially in a market that's still so new and growing and developing. So that's one. And then our portfolio companies, we're closing our 6th and 7th companies right now. 4 out of the 7 are female founded or co-founded, but just awesome, amazing humans that are building companies oftentimes for the first time in the market. So constantly looking for people like, I mean, we're just investing in an electric vehicle micromobility company. And obviously like this space here is huge, but like these guys are effing awesome. And the more I can connect them to other humans that have built companies in similar spaces, the better, and fintech companies, all of that. So that's my ask.
Love it. I have a quick ask. Can everybody smile? I'm going to try to take a great little screenshot here of Sarah with your little buddy as well. I think we nailed it. Phenomenal. And, you know, we were talking about international entrepreneurship, and, you know, if you're doing anything and you have to look after multiple elephants at the same time, you would obviously need skills in multitasking.
Goodbye, Mike.
Good night. I love you all.
It always takes me a second to hear whether it's actually the joke, and then I'm like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, I know.
We got a face palm, we got some
Oh.
rubs. Sarah, thank you, by the way, for all of your hard work organizing this conference. This has been a lot of fun all week, and I believe this is the last session. Are we've come to the end?
Save the best for last.
Last session of our conference. Thank you all so much for your investment and your expertise. It's been an amazing session and an amazing conference overall.